But the first step to understanding these different political systems is to understand the political ideologies that guide these political systems. So, political ideologies are really the beliefs and practices that guide political actors in their decision-making processes. Ideologies really reflect kind of the underpinning belief systems of any given society. These are kind of the belief systems that structure or inspire political leaders to take particular action. So they operate within these different political systems. So let's talk a little bit about specific ideologies. So political ideologies are really defined as sets of political values held by individuals, individuals regarding the fundamental goals of politics. So that is, ideologies are concerned with the ideal relationship between balancing individual freedoms and equality. And ideologies really tend to focus on the proper role for political institutions in achieving and maintaining that relationship. Okay, so ideologies structure our view on the ideal relationship between equality and freedom and how institutions should be designed to shape that mix between freedom and equality. In general, political ideologies can be divided into 5 categories. Okay, ideologies can be divided into 5 categories: liberalism, communism, social democracy, fascism, and anarchism. These are the big 5 political ideologies that shape a society's belief system about freedom and equality. So let's begin looking at liberalism. Okay, so what I'm talking about is classic liberalism. Okay, classic liberalism differs from the conception of liberalism that we might be familiar with here in the United States. So essentially, liberalism believes that politics should create the maximum degree of liberty for all people. Liberals contend that the lower the ability of the state to interfere in the affairs of citizens will actually expand the scope and promise of human activity. So, in short, liberals would believe less government intervention will lead to the greater societal good and increased productivity, etc. So you can think about how that differs from the American conception of a liberal, a Democrat, etc., which would focus much more on government intervention into social life, into the economy, etc. So traditional liberals, classical liberals like we're talking about today, minimal government involvement, a great deal of individual freedom, whereas the American conception of liberal, Democratic Party, etc., much more intervention, much more emphasis on equality. So the next ideology that we're going to look at is communism. So whereas liberalism seeks greater degrees of freedom and is willing to accept higher rates of inequality, a communist ideology is willing to sacrifice significant amounts of individual freedom in exchange for greater equality. Okay, so let's think about some of the basic premises of this communist ideology. So originally we have to go back to Karl Marx. And so Karl Marx essentially argues that all of mankind and all of human history is essentially divided into 2 classes. We have the bourgeoisie, which are the political elites, those who control capital, and the proletariat, who essentially are the workers and have no access to capital. So for Marx and for communists, it's the bourgeoisie, this elite class, that has control of the state. Okay, they control state power. And they use this state power to extract the resources from the poor working classes, the proletariat. So this leads to a tremendous amount of economic and political inequality within a given society. So we see the rich getting more rich and the poor continuing to be exploited and becoming poorer and poorer, etc. So a communist would argue that in order for these inequalities to be addressed, to have an improved level of equality across the system, the state has to control all economic resources. And by doing so, the state will redistribute wealth in a more equitable manner. Now, the problem with the communist ideology, at least in my opinion, is, the main crux of politics in general, that balance between equality and individual freedom. I tend to side on the side of individual freedom. The communists, much more interested in greater equality. So our next political ideology is social democracy. And social democracy shares some of the ideas of both liberalism and communism. That is, social democracy accepts a strong role for private ownership and freedom for markets to operate, but it still argues that a society can and should achieve a certain degree of equality. Now, most of the social democratic countries are found in Europe, and particularly the most extreme social democratic countries can be found in the Scandinavian countries, Norway, Sweden, Finland, etc. And even our neighbors to the north, Canada, would be considered a social democracy. So, although in a social democratic system we are going to have pretty high degrees of freedom for the individual, we also see the state implementing policies to improve equality across the board. So, in a social democratic state, you will find things like free education, free health care, much greater social safety nets for people who lose jobs, more money for the disabled, and what have you. So we have individual freedom, but we also have a strong emphasis on generating equality across individuals as well. So we also have fascism as an ideology. And so fascism is most closely associated with Nazi Germany and fascist Italy during World War II. So fascism rejects both individual freedom and rejects notions of equality. Rather, fascism contends that people and groups of people are classified in terms of inferiority and superiority. And fascists tend to develop hierarchies based on these perceived differences. So within this fascist state, the state itself is one overarching body. There is no political parties, there's no competition, there's no dissent under the state umbrella. We also see a big decline in individuality. So in a fascist state, individuality means nothing. Everyone is obligated to support and strengthen the state, even at great cost to themselves. So in a fascist state, you have high rates of capacity, meaning they can provide goods and services and things that people need quite well. And they also have high degrees of autonomy, meaning they can operate any way they want without fear of any internal or external opposition to the rule of the state. So fascism. Alright, the last ideology we're going to look at is anarchism. So anarchism is different from other ideologies we've so far examined. All of the other ideologies may disagree on the degree to which the state intervenes in individual day-to-day activities, intervention in the markets, provision of goods and services, etc. But all of these ideologies agree that the state is a very important part of any political society. Anarchism differs in the fact that they reject the whole concept of a state. Anarchists contend that states tend to eliminate freedom for individuals, and they tend to implement, like the communist idea, inequality. So anarchists stress the elimination of the state as an institution. They also contend, some anarchists contend, that we also need to abolish private property. And if we do so, abolish the state, abolish private property, essentially we would have much greater individual freedom and much less inequality. Anarchists would argue that we can abolish the state and subsequently get rid of inequality through individuals coming together in a cooperative fashion to achieve some sort of common goal. Kind of a little bit different from our other ideologies. So those are the five basic ideologies: anarchism, fascism, social democracy, communism, liberalism. And as we move forward through our next 3 chapters, we're going to see how these different ideologies structure different types of states. So stay tuned.